Welcome to Inside Academia, the weekly program where we take a look behind the ivory curtain, seeking a frank discussion of American education. I'm your host, Andy Nash. My guest today is Dr. James Budziszewski. He is Professor of Government and Philosophy at the University of Texas at Austin. He's also the author of several books, including What We Can't Not Know, A Guide, The Line Through the Heart, Natural Laws, Fact, Theory, and Sign of Contradiction, The Revenge of Conscience, Evangelicals in the Public Square, and for a more contemporary audience, How to Stay Christian in College, and forthcoming On the Meaning of Sex. Dr. J. Budziszewski, welcome to Inside Academia.
Thank you. I'm glad to be with you.
I'd like to talk to you today about your most recent book and what the takeaway message of it can be for young people. The most recent book you have out, The Line Through the Heart, Natural Laws, Fact, Theory, and Sign of Contradiction. The review of it on Amazon.com it tries to entice the reader by saying that our hearts are riddled with desires and oppose their deepest longings because we demand to have happiness on terms that make happiness impossible. And then it asks the question, why, and what can we do about it? Suggesting that there's some sort of inherent contradiction with the way we're not so much wired, but the way we're thinking today. First, in the context of that, can you summarize for us first, what is the philosophy of natural law, and how does it apply to that statement I just read there?
Okay, well, that's really two questions. Let me take the first one first. What is the philosophy of natural law? You know, there are some foundational moral principles, some basics of right and wrong, of good and evil, that a person with a normal adult mind literally can't not know. It's impossible not to be aware of them. Even the thief really does, deep down, know the wrong of theft. The adulterer knows that he ought to be faithful to his spouse. The murderer knows the wrong of murder. When we pretend to ourselves that we don't know these things, when we're really playing at being moral skeptics, and we're playing the game rather badly. It isn't convincing. These precepts are not only right for everyone, but they're at some deep level known to everyone. Now, sometimes these principles are called the natural law. More often, we use the expression the natural law for these principles along with their corollaries, their implications, which are more detailed and which maybe you have to think about a good deal in order to know them. It's obvious why we call this law. This is moral law, but why would we say that it's natural? Because it's built in to the deep structure of the human moral intellect. It's woven into the rest of our nature, because it's about what really is in nature, not convention, not just made-up constructs or conventions. So this is a natural law. So it arises from how we are made, from the manner of our design, of our creation.
So basically suggesting that morality is in fact rational and natural.
It's rational and natural, and sometimes people say, well, if it's rational, it's not natural, and if it's natural, it's not rational. People think doing what comes naturally means acting like an animal. Well,
right.
No.
Impulsively, yeah.
Yeah, acting impulsively, acting according to your instincts is natural for an animal. It actually isn't natural for us. To act according to your impulses and ignore your rational nature is really unnatural for a human being. And, the truth is that in the literal sense, in the strict sense, it's not even possible for a person to live like an animal. You may have an ideology of saying, I'm just a mammal, I'll follow my instincts, I'll act like an animal, but you're imitating one. You can't. You're thinking about it.
Mm-hmm. Animal isn't the analogy more to say there that the law of nature would be to simply give into one's desires, just as an animal would, as opposed to trying to rise up to the more civilizing force and effect of using reason and trying to temper your own ambition, or I should say your inclinations, and rationalizing what is right and what is wrong, and doing what is essentially the harder choice rather than giving into what is easy.
Well, yes, but my point is that doing so is natural for us. We're not at war with our nature when we regulate our impulses according to reason and step back and ask, yes, but now why do I have this impulse? What is this about? I desire to eat, but do I need to eat right now? That person looks sexually attractive, but should I be sleeping with her? You know, animals mate, we marry. We invest everything that we do with rational and spiritual meaning, and are directed by this. Yeah,
so
sure.
If we're not at war with our nature, then can you explain the statement there from the preview of your book that says we demand to have happiness on terms that make happiness impossible? What exactly does that mean? How is that so?
Yeah, the fact is that, all right, to go back to the animal, he doesn't have to think about whether he's going to act naturally. It's spontaneous for him to obey his instincts. For a rational creature, or a being with a rational nature, it's not entirely spontaneous. You do have to think about it. You may have to exercise discipline. Mm-hmm. It's one thing to say, I see that it wouldn't be good for me to act on this impulse at this time. I don't want to do this, but I should want to. I do want to do this, but I shouldn't want to. This may be hard for us. We have to learn disciplines. We have to acquire virtues. We have to participate in the social practices like the discipline of the family or the discipline of fatherhood in which we learn these virtues. That's hard. It takes work. It's right. But one good thing about it is that it becomes second nature, like a ballerina who has to go through the difficult training of dancing and does it to the point where eventually it looks as though it didn't have to be learned because it's second nature.
Now, would you say that these are the sort of things that I guess, and I apologize, I'm not entirely familiar with who the intended audience of your most recent book is, but with respect to, let's say, young people in college, do you see inherent, not a contradiction, but a confusion of what the inherent natural purpose is? I mean, you wrote this other book, How to Stay Christian in College. If you can elaborate on that, because, most people, they look at these titles and they'll think that, this must be a book about philosophy, or that must be a book about religion. But in reality, they can serve as important guides for people that are searching for some kind of meaning and purpose in their lives. And that's true especially among young people. So you can kind of juxtapose the two.
Yes, well, now these different books that I've written are written for overlapping but somewhat different audiences. For instance, my most recent book on natural law, The Line Through the Heart, is a somewhat more advanced book on natural law. I didn't write it just for scholars. I wrote it for I wrote it so that intelligent general readers would be able to read it with understanding, but it'll be some work, but that it has something to offer the scholar too. Now, if you're a beginner in natural law or a college student, I would be more likely for a first book, if it was one of mine, to recommend What We Can't Not Know, a guide. It was intended to try to clarify the rational foundations of what you might call our common moral sense. The other book, one of the other books that you mentioned, How to Stay Christian in College, is not about natural law per se, although it refers to it. Christians do believe in natural law, as people of some of the faith traditions do too. But it's about another aspect of the regulation of life. It's about reconciliation with God from the standpoint of my faith tradition, which believes that this is achieved through faith in Jesus Christ. And it is just as some of my writings about natural law are a response to the challenges of a disordered moral culture, in which we want to live in ways, we have desires to live in ways that ultimately frustrate us, defeat us, make us unhappy and miserable. We have to come to terms with that and make moral sense of this. How to Stay Christian in College is about a somewhat different. It includes that, but it's about how to live in a way that, in the challenge of the aggressively secular aggressively, often amoralist and almost deliberately atheistic environment of the modern college campus, in how to grapple with that in a way that you can actually grow in your faith instead of becoming weakened in it and abandoning it. And that came partly out of my own experience. When I went off to college, I actually did lose my faith. It wasn't until 10 years later that I recovered it, and I knew what I suffered as a consequence of this betrayal. So I see many of my own undergraduate students who happen to share my faith going through the same thing. I can't talk about this in the classroom. I'm a teacher. I'm not a preacher, but I can write a book about this.
Right.
And so I did that.
Yeah, because I mean, in the conclusion of the preview here for the book, your most recent book, The Line Through the Heart, it says here that you have an important examination of the subject which helps us make sense of why habits that run against our nature have become second nature and why our world seems to be going mad.
Yes.
So it sounds like what you're saying, if I have it correct, correct me if I'm wrong, that we've made the wrong habits become second nature, and we have to go back and rediscover what the right habits are and make those second nature so that we don't have to consciously think about doing the right thing. Would that be a gross oversimplification, or?
No, it isn't. It's very good. Let me give you an example. It was not this generation of young people growing up. It was my generation that invented the so-called sexual revolution. Mm-hmm. And the promise of the sexual revolution was going to be that by being released from the oppressive, burdensome shackles of an outmoded morality, you'd be able to be more free and authentic and fulfilled and happy. You know, it hasn't worked that way. I find that my students are often quite depressed. The hooking up culture is rampant on college, and you know, we aren't designed for hooking up. It really is contrary to the law of our nature. We're designed with a view to sexual faithfulness, to marriage and family life. And you may have a desire to just hook up with somebody that you happen to see and who happens to be willing to go to bed with you. But well, then, as you know, you want to ask, for instance, how many young women wake up crying in the morning? The guy's gone. He didn't even say goodbye. How easy is it to stand buck naked in front of a man who hasn't given his life to you? Men, how do you feel about yourself when you've just used another human person as though she were just a bag of tissue for temporary pleasure, and you didn't even interact with her as a human being? There's some sense of the betrayal of your vocation to care for her. We weren't made for this. We may have desires for this, and so we imagine, well, it would have to make me happy because I desire it. If isn't happiness by definition the satisfaction of desire? And the funny thing is, no, happiness turns out not to be just the satisfaction of desire. It turns out to be something much more complex, which requires the regulation of desire and requires us to submit our desires to the guidance of reason in accordance with some other much deeper patterns that are built into our nature. So that's why this is important, and that's an example of these wrong habits like hooking up, these ways of living that may seem more natural to us, and yet ultimately they run counter to our nature. They frustrate our deepest longings for connection, for meaning in our lives, for happiness, and ultimately for holiness.
Okay. And I'm sure you're going to talk a lot about that in your forthcoming book on the meaning of sex. Lastly, how has any of this been received at the ISI conference? You're there in Princeton, New Jersey, Princeton University for the Intercollegiate Studies Institute's conference there. How has it been received thus far?
It's been received well by these young scholars. I get a lot of questions because, and this is one of the reasons why these conferences are held, there are so many things that are parts of our civilizational heritage, right, like the natural law tradition, that we ought to be taught when we're being educated, that ought to be part of a liberal arts education, anybody's education, but we don't. I wasn't taught these things when I was going through college. I was taught very little about them, even in graduate school. And so there's an opportunity for people to learn this sort of thing. There may be a lot of other questions. I have to think about that. I have to struggle with that. Is that really true? What about this? What about that? But there's a hunger to hear more about this. It helps to make sense of the world. It helps to make sense of our own nature. And so I find that it's very well received.
Okay, excellent. Well, maybe at a future time we can dwell further into the idea of morality and virtue insofar as character development is concerned as a mission of higher education, and how universities have sort of lost that mission or that scope of their mission. But that's all the time we have. Dr. J. Budziszewski, I want to thank you for joining us on Inside Academia today.
It's been my pleasure.
It's been a privilege speaking with you, sir. That'll do it for us today on Inside Academia. I'm Andy Nash. Join us again next week, as every week, as we take you for a look behind the ivory curtain.